This is the latest 7.62 NATO weapon in Tarkov. It can take a 50-round drum magazine, shoot in full auto, and today I'll be showing you where to get it, which might be easier than you think, and also how to build one of the best weapons in the entire game. In patch 16, BSG brought in the X17 SCAR. This is technically a completely different weapon to the existing tan and black variants of the SCAR H, because in Tarkov, the lower of the weapon is the starting point, even if they have compatible parts. The X17 can't be bought on its own as a fully made weapon, but the lower itself is present on Mechanic 4, as well as on the flea market, which is quite strange because the other versions of the SCAR H can't be bought on the flea at all and are currently banned. One of the main issues that players have when starting to look at the X17 is that the upper receiver for the SCAR H is not available anywhere on the traders, and only scam listings are present on the flea. This means that we have to do something a little bit different to usual when we're building it, and the best way to go about this is to buy a regular SCAR H from the traders and swap the parts over onto the X17 lower. Which one to get depends on exactly which build you're going for, but the short barrel Mechanic 4 SCAR in tan at 130,000 rubles is typically the cheapest option. There is a medium barrel version on Peacekeeper for $1,150, which comes out to something like 170k, and the long barrel version in black, also from Peacekeeper 4, which equates to about 180k. There is also a barter on Mechanic 3 for another medium barrel tan version as well, but this one is quite a bit more expensive than the other options. However, it's the earliest one that you can get access to, so if you're desperate to try this out as soon as possible, you can get this one before you have access to level 4 traders, technically from level 30. Once you've bought one of these, you just drag over the upper receiver and the other parts onto the X17 SCAR lower until it becomes a workable gun, and from here we can start to mod it. Now let's go through some of the builds for this weapon. Here is how it should start out once you've taken your X17 lower and replaced everything over onto the top. The main thing that I would like to point out is that if you're building this outside of making an actual gun, so if you don't have a gun right in front of you, make sure that you have the parts of the right color on your preset, otherwise it's a right pain to fix, especially the upper receiver. If you ever have a black SCAR, for example, then this will try to buy the black upper receiver when you build it. So you kind of need a preset saved for each different color of SCAR that you have, because once you move the stuff over, the preset won't understand, and as soon as you take the upper receiver away, it deletes everything else on the gun. So just something to bear in mind before you start. Make sure that you begin using the right colors of the actual build that you're going to want to change ultimately. Now the SCAR is actually quite fiddly to make these days because of all of the changes that BSG added last wipe. It does make the gun a lot better, but it is quite tricky to know exactly where the line sits. The easier parts are the bits at the back of the weapon. So this is how it looks to begin with. We have the regular SCAR folding stock polymer adapter, and then we have the retro stock that goes on top of that, and then a butt pad on top of this. It may look like there's a lot of choice now, because instead of the folding polymer stock, you can add either this, which is the SCAR stock adapter, which is basically a buffer tube on its own, or you can add this, which is the RSA SCAR adapter, which allows you to add your own buffer tube. The problem with these two mods, as you can probably see, is that this one has -1% recoil and -1 ergo, which is actually really bad for a buffer tube, so you definitely want to add your own buffer tube if you're going to add a buffer tube. And then on this side, although this does actually allow you to add your own buffer tube, something like the advanced tube, which is typically quite good, the other version of the SCAR stock that comes basically by default is actually really good and better than pretty much anything that you can put on here. There are technically ways that you can get high ergo by putting on something like the Viper stock, but you end up losing loads and loads of recoil to do that. So the one that you want to look out for is this one in here. There's a couple of different options because of the colors, but it's this VS11. So we're going to do the VS11 in tan because I'm starting with the tan SCAR. I'm going to put this on, and you can see immediately if I just hover over the difference that this makes. It's +4 ergo and -6 recoil, which is no joke, and that's basically better than all of the other usual like bang for buck things that you can get in the buffer tube category. So we're going to stick that guy on. It still takes the SCAR cheek rest as well, which is one of the reasons why it ends up being so good, because this adds 5 ergonomics as well. It just makes it way better than the buffer tube versions, so you basically just go with this. The grip is still relatively straightforward. If you want the best in slot, you just go for the growl. The growl is +15 ergo, which is really good and ends up with 72, and we're definitely going to need this for some of these builds. This is an endgame build, so it's going to be quite hard to build without max traders, so just beware of that. So you can maybe skimp if you want to go loud, but if you want to go suppressed, you really probably want to put on the best of components that you can. Now, I kind of wanted to talk about the magazines a little bit later, but it doesn't really make sense to do that because it has such an outsized impact on the performance of the gun. So the reason why this thing is good now, I'm actually just going to stick on like any old foregrip over here just to get rid of this green bar. The reason why the X17 is so good now is because of this, the 50-round drum magazine. But as usual, you know, we've got -15 ergo. It's relatively heavy, and once you've filled this with M80, M61, and other ammo like that, it ends up having a very, very large impact on the weight of the weapon, which has an ergo impact as well on things like overswing. And overswing does come into play with this weapon quite significantly. You can't buy this on the flea market, but you can buy it from Mechanic for a barter, and there's no quest for this or anything. It's just 1 ore and 3 TP bricks, these TNTs. These TNTs are getting more and more and more expensive, and you can imagine this is probably only go up and up, so maybe keep a few TNT bricks if you want to. Definitely loot them in raid, because these things are always going to be in demand. And once you've bartered with one of those, you can stick this guy in here. Now, this brings us on to modding the rest of the weapon. We'll just get rid of the front sight for the moment and the rear sight, because we'll change those over in a bit. And we're going to get rid of these Scar side rails as well, because we're going to change that as well. Same thing with the Scar bottom. There's a couple of things we need to take into consideration when we're modding the Scar. Firstly, there are 3 different barrel lengths. The long barrel and the medium barrel are kind of the same, and then the short barrel is sort of on its own. We then have a bunch of different handguard options. So the one that you start with is this Scar bottom rail. Then you've also got this MREX M-Lock rail, which is the one that we used to have. These two are basically just to be disregarded. There's some very, very specific reasons why you might want to run a Scar with the bottom rail. The reason why is that it can take the CQR, but if you're not looking to use the CQR, then I wouldn't bother, because it adds weight to the gun where you don't need it. The other 2 options are these ones, the Altor handguards, the CASV, and then you also have this one, the PMM M-Lock lower rail in FDE. Broadly speaking, this is the recoil build, and this is the ergo build. I'm going to end up doing the ergo build for a lot of them, just because that's the part that we're normally kind of stuck on when it comes to overswing and trying to optimize the actual weapon. But to start with, let's just look at how low the recoil can actually get. So what we're going to do is we're going to stick on a long barrel, because as I said before, these 3 barrels are a little bit different. And with the short barrel, if you add on something like, I'll just show you this for demonstration purposes. If you add on the CASV Scar here, with the short barrel, you can't attach the extender, and the extender gives you -1% recoil and -1 ergonomics. So this changes the build a little bit and makes it better for recoil. And so we need to be running either the 16-inch or the 20-inch to be able to add this on. Underneath, we're just going to add the RK2. For argument's sake for the time being. The suppressor is the same as always. The suppressor ordering hasn't really changed very much. So if you want to go suppressed and have the best in-slot recoil, then you need to have the PRS QDC on top of the QDC muzzle brake kit. There are 2 compensators that work for this, and one is the flash hider, and that one's nowhere near as good at recoil. So you can see this basically gets us to 62 already, and you can see how low the ergonomics is. That's mainly because of the RK2. The technical lowest recoil that you can get to is the one using the BMD, because the BMD is very slightly better, and that gets you to 60. So I mean, this is pretty fearsome, right? This is similar to something like the FAL builds back in the day, the old juice cannon builds with really low ergonomics, but you've got 60 vertical recoil, so it's actually pretty insane. Now, as you can imagine, you can mix and match these various different barrels and these different handguard combinations to get a bunch of different builds. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put up a chart of various different combinations all mixed together so you can see, because that's actually much easier than me going through them one by one. And you can see here how the ergonomics, the recoil, and the weight changes depending on exactly what you do with them. I tried to make them all as consistent as possible. So this is a QDC suppressor like we saw, with an SE5 foregrip, a Voodoo using the Geisley mount, which gives you an extra 1 ergo, a Growl pistol grip, and the VS11 stock like we saw before. And this should give you a good idea of what these look like at various points in the modding curve. However, one thing that we are interested in specifically, usually, is how much recoil can we get away with before we hit the point of overswing. Now, overswing is a concept I've talked about quite a few times in the past. It's basically the point at which the weapon starts swinging when you ADS. It's got nothing to do with speed of ADS, really. It's more to do with how the reticle swings out when you try to aim on a target and then settles back in. And it has a dramatic impact on the feeling of stability of the weapon, because clearly when you're trying to get on target and the actual reticle itself is moving and not snapping into the center, ends up meaning that your time to proper ADS is 3 times longer or something. So it's well worth avoiding if you can. Now, I have 2 builds here for you. The first one here is the loud one, and this is basically the lowest recoil that I could get to without suffering from overswing using the loud build. And this one is 55 ergonomics and 73 vertical recoil, obviously using the BMD. And the way that this one functions is with the medium barrel, with the VSS, as you might imagine. And then we've got the PMM mount. So we've actually gone for the ergonomics version of the handguard. I'll show you how to build this up from scratch. So to start with, we use this PMM lower rail. You can use the black or the tan one, it's up to you. Underneath here, we're going to add a rail so we can add a vertical foregrip, but I'll add one in a moment, just to explain in a second. Then we've got this, which is the MRE XL extension. On the ergo version of the weapon, using this PMM thing, you've got +6 ergonomics. It's quite a lot more than the CSV version, which is why this one ends up being better for overswing overall. And then also, not to mention that, you've then got these as well, the M-Lock cantilever mounts, one on that side and one on that side. That gives another 2 ergo. Finally, you have this section as well, which I accidentally added before, but this is the PMM rail elimination panels. So you want to put those on as well, and that adds an extra 2 ergonomics. Gets you to 56 76 and 78. Now, I toyed around with various different foregrips here. You could start off with the Cobra if you want. That gets you to 65 ergo. That's very, very high. But in the end, I settled on one of these, Ossovets, which is -3 recoil and +1 ergonomics. It's a bit lighter than the RK1. You could put on the RK1 canted if you really wanted to, but I ended up just using this and getting to 57 ergonomics and 73 vertical recoil, which is this build here. And the reason why this one is very slightly lower is because I also added something on the front, because I like having something like a WMX or whatever, because this allows you to get better point fire. So this gun, 55 ergonomics, as we've ended up, because this takes -2, 55 ergonomics and 73 vertical recoil. This will have no overswing at all, although you are loud. The other build that's worth looking at is the suppressed version, which is this one here at 52 ergonomics and 91 vertical recoil. You can see we've really had to make some compromises to make this function. And what this uses is the short barrel and then the wave QD on the front. We've got the same kind of formulation here. We've got the PMM low, but unfortunately, because we're using the short barrel, we then can't attach this front section. But it does end up making sense. You have PMM elimination panels here as well for +2. And then we have to use the wave QD because otherwise it just doesn't work. And the reason why is because the 6.3 kilograms, which is what this comes to, is just about enough with the 52 ergonomics to let us not have any overswing with this gun. And I really would prefer to use something like the Thunder Beast on here, but it just isn't quite good enough. Now, the one awkward thing about this weapon is that this only allows you to avoid the overswing without any tactical devices. So you don't have the ability to add something like the WMX that gives you a point fire bonus, because if you do, your overswing comes back. And the only way to avoid that is to downgrade the wave QD to something even worse, something like the DT hybrid, and then your vertical recoil is nearly 100, and I just don't really think it's worth it. So it's quite a difficult decision to actually make. So you'd rather use something a little bit better than this, but you just don't have the choice. Even adding something small like this, the ANPQ on top, that now gives you overswing because of this extra 200 grams. It's really crazy how on the line it is, but there's not really anything about this that you can upgrade. You either downgrade the suppressor so that it's got a better weight and ergo ratio, or you just forgo having one of these tactical devices. So depending on how sensitive you actually are to overswing, depends on whether you want to put up with it or not. If you don't care about overswing so much, then you can pretty much just do what you like and go with the CASV kind of build. And this one then allows you to use something like the CQR, so then you can get some decent middle ground, but this will certainly have overswing on it. The only other way that you can avoid this is by using the 25 rounders. Now, these are pretty powerful because they came with the MDR last wipe when the spear got added. But the problem with them is that they're really, really pricey. They're about 61k on the flea market. Normally in peak periods, this jumps up to about 85k. And they're only accessible on Peacekeeper after completing Lightkeeper's last task, which really does put them very far down in the progression compared to something like the Scar X17, which, as we saw, we can basically get it built at level 30 because people are putting them up on the flea market, and you can also buy the Scar itself using the mechanic barter. So the accessibility is there, even if the price is quite expensive. Now, there is one way to get access to these. If you don't want to purely pay the price on the flea, or there aren't any or something, or it's really expensive, there is one purchase here on mechanic for this, which does have the 25 rounder on it. So you can buy this and like take the 25 rounder off and sell it, for example, if you're just going to use an MDR, or you could use this, like take this off, put it in the Scar or something like that. But clearly that decreases the amount of ergonomics you need quite dramatically on the Scar, simply because you're only holding 25 rounds now and the ergo penalty is nowhere near as much. So we're getting a swing of 12 or something, and you're only holding 25 rounds rather than 50. So that has a massive implication on weight and makes some of these builds more possible to use without overswing. But I think with the expense of how much they are for an extra 25 bullets, I don't know whether you're better off just going with the 20s, right? And just using a regular Scar build. The only other thing to add is that if you do want to add a bipod, you probably want to go with the PMM versions, because this one, once you've added the MRE, you then have this little thing here, the M-Lock bipod mount. And once you stick that on, you can then add this, which is the Harris SBRM bipod, onto the Scar. So if you want a bipod version, then probably go with this thing. Otherwise, if you want recoil purely, then go for the CASV builds instead. The final part for the Scar is probably the ammo. I did a video very recently about M61 and how you can get access to it relatively early, because now, rather than being behind trophies, it's behind Wet Job Part 6 that requires you to get to Bolt Action Skill level 7. There's a bunch of strategies that I've got in that video, so if you haven't seen it yet, then go over and watch that. Outside of M61, that you should be crafting all the time if you have the capacity to, you should be buying M80. This requires you to do Revision Lighthouse, and then you can purchase it from Peacekeeper 4, or alternatively, you can get Ref to level 3, and you can buy boxes of M80 for GP coins from him. I prefer to buy them in rubles, because if I can spend rubles, then I will, because GP coins are a more limited resource than rubles are. But I know some people use Ref a lot to get M80 as well. And typically what I do is I stack some M80 underneath the M61, less so as I get more M61, to be honest, but it's always worth taking one extra mag of M80 there, given that it's relatively plentiful. Both of these rounds are very good for what they do. M80 got a buff this wipe up to 43 pen, so even headshots over a relatively long distance through class 4 helmets, and M61 is clearly insane because it 2-taps everybody wearing a class 5 armor. And combined with the 50 round magazine in the Scar, and even the 20s honestly, this gun has become extremely powerful. It's one of the best weapons in the game in my opinion, probably second only to the spear with its ammo, but because that's locked behind high level lightkeeper tasks, more people will be able to get to the Scar with 50 rounders and M61 than I think will be able to use the spear with SIG Hybrid. So next up, let's check out a few clips of this weapon in action. Oh, scavs. No. Seems pretty decent. Jeez. They're on the same level as me or not? Do you think he was down in the hole though? Or same level? I'm not actually sure. Yeah, the X17 gets the drum mag. Gonna quickly repack the drum. A little. Maybe I'll just leave it as is for now, actually. Scouts shouting, so we can hear something's going on. If someone was to come up the staircase, we'd see them here. That they could be trying to flank. I guess they were. They're crazy. You know it's a scout when they're like running like Benny Hill. Reload the most and best way to level up bolties. Well, I should have bought real estate keys. Why don't I have the real estate keys? I hate moving around in this building. What the hell was that? Sounded like Beastmaster's ult. What the hell? That was so weird. I want to check out the scarf, but... I literally just saw someone. Oh, man. Kind of spicy. This used to be quite good. There's nothing in here as well. There was somebody in that overpass thing. Like, genuinely. I saw them, and when I looked back, they were gone. The usual rule for me in EFT is that if I see them, they saw me. You know? That's the rule that you have to live by, basically. I find a lot of the time. Okay, we're just taking our time. We don't need to rush. But there's obviously somebody there. That scab wasn't shooting at me. The one in the floor above. I really don't think he was. So... yeah, I'm doing Debtor. So we're nearly there. We're getting kind of close. But there's kind of scary sounds. That's why I ran up this way. Surely that scav's I go onto PMC? Yep, it is. There's a meta scar. Pretty much. Pretty much, yeah. I would say. It's a little light on Ergo, but that's because of the drum and stuff. So you can build... It depends on what your like tolerance is for ergonomics. So you can build one that's slightly better on Ergo, but you lose a bit of recoil for that. That was nasty. Oh dear, that's not good. So as usual, a big shout out to all my patrons, and as always, have fun in your raids.